I want to begin by flagging that there's a lot of overlap between this and the insurgency section of conflicts, so we're going to return to this later, and don't worry too much about the fact that this is a relatively short workshop. In fact, maybe be happy about it. That means you have less listening to do. Okay, so revolutions are uniquely difficult to get off the ground. The primary reason for this is just that the collective action problem is particularly severe with regards to them. Revolutions require that many people act at the exact same time, but each individual that would act has a particularly strong reason to wait for others to move first. So if you protest alone, you think you will be arrested, killed, or fired from your job, or maybe tortured or something like that. And as a result, people are in the dark as to how many people will turn out to protests until a critical mass is already on the streets. And so very frequently, states which have the physical conditions for revolutions don't see them triggered because it is difficult to get the initial wave of the revolution started. This is why, for example, many revolutions begin with mass protest movements where distaste becomes publicly known but the state doesn't crack down for lack of protester violence, or alternatively, when they do crack down, people know that they have the power to overwhelm state violence against them. Crackdowns are somewhat not cohesive because police don't actually want to enforce the state will, that sort of thing. The second thing is just that there are particularly intensely strong free rider incentives that exist with revolutions. So the reason for this is just because if you are an individual in a society where you think a revolution is happening, if it is underway or whatever, it's very unlikely that your particular contribution to the revolution movement itself is going to be very instrumental in its success or failure. It probably won't change the balance of probability of whether or not the revolution will succeed particularly intensely. And that means that since you know that if you go out and protest on the streets, you probably have some legitimate threat of state violence thrown against you, it's probably just considerably more in your interest to not go out and protest. And so as a result, very frequently, revolutions are underrepresented even when they're underway based on the amount of interest that people have in them succeeding. So then, why do revolutions sometimes begin despite this major barrier to their beginning? Revolutions typically require a combination of 4 factors. First, they require grievance. Second, they require that there be some ability to organize. Third, they require the opportunity to have a revolution. Fourth, they require a belief shift that the revolution could actually succeed. And also, most of the time, they require a sort of singular event that creates the focal point of the revolution to begin with. So first, on grievances, that is, that people have a reason to want the regime gone. Most of the time, grievances, 1, build up slowly before a revolution begins, so very frequently there can be lots of different grievances that individual groups have with the state that build up slowly to the point where people feel eventually that it is just worth revolting. And additionally, in many instances, grievances are fairly disparate. So one group might have one particular problem with the state and a different group might have a completely different problem with the state. And as a result, while they might be able to unite over the common enemy of the state, frequently this has a couple of effects that we'll touch on later. What are the primary ways in which grievance can manifest? The first is just economic grievances. So maybe the regime failed economically. Maybe it didn't provide basic food security. Maybe there was rampant inflation. Maybe there was lots and lots of unemployment. Maybe there was housing insecurity. Maybe people didn't see their basic economic needs being met. Maybe infrastructural development was just going far too slow. Frequently, this specific one manifests differently for different portions of the revolution. So business owners, for example, might be annoyed at all of the bribes that they constantly need to acquiesce to get through the miles of bureaucracy that the state has put up, while workers may resent low wages and repression of unions. And there are instances in which the economic grievances for want to revolt directly come in tension and contradict one another, and this has pretty important implications that we'll talk about later. The second is blocked mobility. So maybe revolutions often arise from people whose expectations have been raised and then frustrated. That is, educated youth, professionals, civil servants, etc., may feel that the regime has not delivered on the promises for their future that they were told they would have access to, when they were told that education or urbanization would bring them access to better opportunities, but instead now they're faced with high unemployment rates and low class mobility. frequently, this grievance is supercharged by seeing members of the political elites post about their lavish lives on social media. So, for example, in the lead up to the July revolutions in Bangladesh, there were a lot of Instagram posts, etc., of members of the ruling class that just kind of like captured the extreme luxury of their lives, their travels to Singapore, the intense parties that they would host. And so, while this wasn't the single focal point of the revolution itself, there were lots of protests in response to this that had already been ongoing. And at the point that the quota system was announced by Sheikh Hasina, all of a sudden there was mass distaste against the government for effectively locking people out of civil servant jobs. Just for context, the situation in Bangladesh was one where the ruling party passed a law that made it so that a considerable portion of civil servant jobs had to be apportioned out to members of the war for Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan. And effectively what that did was it made it so that only like older members of society had access to civil servant jobs, families of those who were already ingrained in the existing regime, and it locked a lot of the individual students out of accessing civil service jobs just by implementing such a strict quota on who exactly was involved. And so this was the single focal point of the revolution itself. That's what sparked everything. It sparked the revolution. It sparked the protest movements on the streets. It sparked state backlash on those protest movements, and then it sparked reverse counter backlash that ended up, resulting in a revolution where Hasina was thrown out of office and had to flee. So that was the situation in Bangladesh, and it's kind of an example of where blocked mobility played a pretty large role in seeing how people have access to mobility, but you don't, as someone who's been promised this mobility by the state, and in a state where economic opportunities were to an extent growing, but only being actually actualized by a small group of people. The third sort of grievance is just political exclusion. So maybe people feel unrepresented in the existing regime. Maybe they feel shut out of political institutions. Maybe they feel like they lack a voice or they lack avenues for peaceful reform. Frequently, while some of the other grievances that we're talking about here are not necessary for creating a situation that leads to revolution, this one is, because generally people will choose to go through existing political institutions unless they truly believe that they do not have access to those institutions and cannot enact any form of peaceful change. Another sort of grievance is just corruption, and I kind of already mentioned this, but if you have to constantly pay bribes for healthcare, education, permits, police protection, etc., it tends to weigh on people pretty intensely. And very frequently, even though corruption can be seen differently by different individuals in different spots of society and in different institutions, the anti-corruption message is one that can be particularly unifying because you see corruption regardless of where or who you are, and so as a result, even if you see that corruption quite differently, you can still rally behind the idea that we want to reduce the corruption inside of the political system. Another grievance that frequently occurs is just a legacy of repression. And so this is one that just kind of bubbles under the surface the majority of the time. But anytime the state cracks down on protesters or represses particular peoples, it obviously builds to the amount of grievance that that group or society writ large feels against the state. And while it is true that very frequently, lots of states have histories of repression, and many of those states don't have active revolutions, it can supercharge revolutions when they do happen, when a single thing that creates sort of mass public awareness occurs. That sort of thing can be then charged by this sort of legacy grievance. The final way that I thought of for how grievances could occur is just moral or ideological betrayal. So, for example, a socialist regime becoming corrupt and unequal, or a democratic regime rigging elections, or a religious regime becoming secular over time. All of these are instances where a revolution could be sparked because you feel as if the regime that had promised something is starting to backtrack from those promises. So very frequently, the way that revolutions shape up is just that people feel as though the promises that the state had given them are being unfulfilled by the state. And so in many instances, you can see the economic opportunities of a state growing, or maybe a state liberalizing or something like that, giving access to things that people might want. But if it isn't fulfilling the promises that it was founded on, then very frequently it can be thrown into revolution, regardless of whether or not people's actual quality of life is increasing or decreasing. Additionally, though, This is true for post-revolution states, and we'll talk about that again in a bit, but it is worth thinking about the fact that at the point that a revolution happens, a lot of implicit or explicit promises are made, and if those aren't fulfilled, very frequently you see revolutionary backsliding. The second thing that revolutions need is just the ability to coordinate, to organize. So what are the primary barriers to organization? The primary one is very obviously just a fear of repression. This can be surveillance. So maybe a state is watching the majority of your actions, has like access to phone information, to information that goes on calls, etc. And so it is quite difficult to actually organize because you know that the state will crack down on it at the point that, they see this sort of thing happening. A lot of the time, it doesn't actually have to be outright surveillance itself. It can just be a belief of being surveilled. Knowing that there is a chance that the state is watching you makes you act very differently. It makes you assume the worst. You are quite risk averse, and therefore you just don't organize, even if you don't know for certain that the state will be surveilling that form of organization, you hedge against the fact that it might do so. Secondarily, states frequently enforce communication control, so state control over media apparatuses, state control over social media platforms, state control over that sort of thing can very frequently make it so that it is quite difficult to organize, and very frequently, this happens through sort of backroom deals with social media platforms outside of the company. Another way that organization failures might occur is just fragmented reasons. So even if a large swath of people deeply oppose the regime, if it isn't for the same reason or is without the same desired future, the groups may not trust each other enough to work together, or they might be ideologically opposed to one another. And so even if there is a lot of grievance with the state, if it doesn't happen to manifest in ways that line up with each other, then very frequently it just doesn't actually get expressed. Third, revolutions require opportunity. So they require the regime to become vulnerable, a trigger point to occur, something like that. What can opportunity look like? Well, it can look like elite fracture. Maybe it's the ruling government splitting, or just some oligarchs inside the state starting to oppose the state and start bankrolling revolutionary action, get involved with organization and that sort of stuff. Maybe it looks like security forces hesitating because they disagree with the regime, or because they just simply aren't paid enough to try and fight back against the mass social pressure that is existing against the regime. Maybe it looks like a succession crisis where the state has all of a sudden the needs for succession, but it's not clear who is going to replace the previous leader, and as a result, revolutionaries feel that it is all of a sudden the time for them to spring to action because the state is quite weak. There are lots of different competing factions that are trying to exert control over it already, and therefore that creates an in for revolutionary wants to maybe co-opt some of them or enter into the ring by themselves. Maybe it looks like repression backfiring. So oftentimes, if the state responds militarily to one very large protest movement, well, in some instances and in some contexts, so for example, in Iran quite recently, it can just reduce the amount of people who are willing to protest because they legitimately fear that the state will have the coercive capability to prevent all of them from protesting, from actually achieving a revolution. In some instances as well, so for example, in Bangladesh and Nepal, this sort of coercive response to protest movements frequently just backfires in the state's face. It creates far more public pressure on the state because people go, there is now moral outrage. I now have strong incentives to attack the state. Maybe the coercive apparatus is not strong enough, or I perceive it is likely to be not strong enough to kill all of us. I have an exception bias to the extent that I think I won't be damaged by this and the people around me won't, and therefore I'm willing to engage in this action because the state did this horrifically wrong thing, and I believe that we should take action against it. And finally, you need a belief shift. So you need people to actually think that the action can work. So preference cascade theory is a theory of revolutions that says that many people secretly oppose the regime but only reveal it when others do. And this frequently explains why revolutions frequently seem very impossible and then all of a sudden happen at once. So there is silent maybe tensions inside of the country, but no one really knows about it, and then all of a sudden the revolution spirals at once and turns into a full-scale revolt that succeeds, or in some instances doesn't succeed. So for example, the Arab Spring uprisings are a perfect example of the preference cascade theory of revolutions in action, to the extent that in those revolutions, all of a sudden, a large amount of discontent with a bunch of different states was finally voiceable over social media. People saw that there was shared discontent, that everyone hated the states around them, and as a result, you saw this sort of revolutionary, mass of people across a large number of different countries. The vast majority of debates about revolutions have to do, however, with the aftermath of revolutions and not the actual lead up to them, and preventing post-revolutionary conflict and return to revolution. So here are some thoughts there. First, here's a long list of ways that revolutions can fail, even when they are initially successful. The first reason is just that there are frequently competing ideologies within the movement itself. So at the point that a revolution succeeds in overthrowing the state, the common enemy disappears. And so suddenly, very intense and uncrossable tensions can arise around the post-fall of the old regime. People have different agendas for the sort of political institutions that they want to see take place. They have different religious agendas. Maybe they have different social agendas. Maybe they have differences in the way that they think that even under a democratic state, the state should function, or the new constitution should be written. All of these can create massive fractures within revolutionary movements themselves, and since frequently these are highly militarized entities, it just frequently means that there is continued revolutionary action post-revolution itself, and frequently instability as a result of that. The second reason is just transitionary governance. So there are very strong incentives for those who gained power via the revolution to not cede that power. So if you have your power now, then you can do the things that you wanted to and why you had the revolution in the first place. But if you step down, you may not be able to, and you may not trust the step-down state apparatus to carry out the things that you wanted to initially carry out. And at the point that you have power, opting into that power is simply far easier for you than letting it go. And so as a result, frequently transitionary governance just doesn't actually turn out in transitioning to a democracy. And in those instances, you can obviously see why people would want to revolt against that, because the promises that the state was based on are not being fulfilled. Very frequently as well, the group that has the most power post-revolution is the most violent and most committed group, because they were willing to go to the furthest lengths to ensure that the old regime fell. They were willing to sacrifice the most. And this means two things. First, it means that frequently they feel as if they are owed the power because they sacrificed the most on the way. There is a strong moralistic claim to the power that they have that may enforce the sense that they should not relinquish it because they are deserved that power. The second thing it means is just that frequently it positions the least willing to yield group as the group that needs to yield power for successful transitions, because this was the group that was the hardest liners, it was the most committed, and they're probably not going to be willing to yield on a lot of things that you do need to yield on naturally in politics, or just to the other things that other members within the revolution wanted to have happen. And quite frequently that is a very bad situation, because given the fact that the people who are in power want to stay in power at that instance because they see the state as, without them, being unwilling to fulfill the goals that they had, you can very frequently get grasping onto the power that you have been granted. The third reason is just elites. So many elites get on board with revolutions because they realize that the direction the tides of history are turning in. And this poses a pretty big post-revolution problem. So those who are just in it out of convenience care far less about the revolution's wants than they care about their own stability or safety. And those who join to gain power will often use the post-revolution chaos to mold the system to their will. The fourth reason that frequently revolutions fail, even post-revolution, is just international will. So most revolutions kind of live and die on foreign aid and support, but foreign aid is never sent in a vacuum. Countries require ideological or material promises from revolutions in order to send aid in the first place. And notice that for revolutions, it is very easy to opt into these sorts of things when the revolution feels like it may not succeed without them. But when success occurs, and you probably also de-weight the consequences of opting in, because one, you're not sure that they will actually ever occur because you're not sure that you will succeed, but also because they're quite far off, and you just weigh the immediate impacts of having this money to a far higher extent than the far off damages that it might result to you. And so, as a result, when success occurs, now the revolution is tied to a bunch of promises that it made in its naivety. promises made to international actors that are frequently contradictory of one another. Say, for example, that we will try to prioritize our alliances with China and the US at the same time in the same field of, alliance. And so as a result, frequently this sort of thing can result in bad taste from other international institutions, but also frequently it can just pull the revolution apart from the insides. It's also worth noting that much foreign monetary support for revolutions is secretly just support for instability, which means that nations giving this support tend to stop as soon as the state apparatus has been disrupted, but before the transition actually succeeds at moving to a better form of governance, which is quite damaging for revolutions. The fifth reason is just the implementation gap. So when revolutions fail to deliver their promises, frequently things dissolve into chaos. Why? Because revolutions are very optimistic, frequently even so to a fault, and it is difficult to understand the reality of the fact that rebuilding a better system takes a lot of time and a lot of suffering in the meantime. Especially, the population literally does not understand this, and as a result doesn't see the suffering that they were promised to avoid as justified. And revolutions are quite prone to fail at this. The primary reason is just that reorganizing society is difficult, and frequently those who rise to the top in a revolution aren't the best peacetime leaders. There are at least four reasons as to why this is the case. The first is just that governance requires a completely different skill set from leadership in revolutions. In revolutions, you primarily need agitators, underground organizers, etc., but now you have to interface with a bunch of difficult to interface with bureaucracy. You need to manage budgets, you need to manage food systems, courts, tax collection, infrastructure, etc. In revolutionary conditions, caution and proceduralism frequently tend to look like cowardice. So you self-select leaders who are the most confrontational and the most decisive, but in peacetime, you need to be cautious, and you need to not take drastic, irreversible actions. You need to ensure that procedures are well built up so that the revolution maintains durability in the long run, and frequently you just position yourself for failure in those conditions. Second, revolutions generally elevate the people who have the most coercive capacity. The actors who frequently become the most decisive in revolutions are those who control guns, who control security networks, military units, because their support is crucial for toppling the old regime in the first place. The problem is, once those figures step into positions of power, because of their connections, they are intensely difficult to subordinate to civilian rule, and they frequently have strong inclinations to resolve disputes coercively rather than democratically, because this is the sort of context in which they existed under prior and during the revolution. Third, those who would be the best leaders, that is, neutral, skilled technocrats, are heavily associated with the old regime because they were neutral and they worked under it and they worked to forward the old regime's maybe economic goals they might have seen as beneficial for everyone, but as a result they are seen as compromised and cannot be reappointed without the revolution losing legitimacy in eyes of the people who revolted. The fourth reason is just that revolutionary leaders frequently make promises of appointments during the revolution to ensure loyalty. So frequently the people who end up being appointed to positions of power are not the people who would be the best in those positions, but just the people who are most loyal to the revolution during the time that the revolution took to actually occur. The second reason that revolutions are prone to fail is just that many wants of the revolution are frequently literally impossible to achieve. So take the example of blocked mobility that we talked about before. Frequently, there's very little that the state has the capacity to do, even with the best of intentions, to allow people class mobility or to open up higher paying jobs. These are just things that kind of have to happen naturally. And as a result, when you make promises based on that, or the revolution implicitly has that sort of promise because you revolted as a result of these conditions, you just are unable to fulfill the promises that you made to the public. That said, revolutions are most likely to succeed under a few conditions. First, if there is a credible transitional authority. And I think this is where the decentralized versus centralized clash is likely to be the most relevant to revolutions, because while it is true that revolutions benefit pretty intensely from being decentralized, to the extent that it means that the state cannot co-opt them or decapitate them quite as easily, and it frequently means more resilient protests, more resilient movements, etc. At the point that you don't have a centralized leader, it is quite difficult to manage to have one person who is, say, in charge of the transitionary government to, actually transitioning to what the revolutionaries wanted. And so frequently revolutions that are more disorganized, more decentralized, will fall apart at the point that they have to figure out how to credibly transition, how to come up with authority figures, etc., because there are so many competing factions that all want to be the person who makes this decision. Second, revolutions are most likely to succeed when there are trustable mechanisms for a negotiated transfer of power. So not only do you need someone to actually initiate this process, you also need to plan out and credibly commit to the process itself. So you need election planning, you need constitution writing, you need a bunch of bureaucratic things that are quite difficult to actually do, especially if you don't have institutional knowledge. Third, they are most likely to succeed when the economy does not immediately collapse. So one of the most common arguments run in revolution debates, or just instability debates generally, is that foreign direct investment will flee as a result of this. And I think this is probably an untrue argument in the majority of cases, because it ignores two things. Foreign direct investment does not literally have legs, get up and walk out of a country. The reality is that existing foreign direct investment is fairly illiquid. It generally involves physical commitments like factories, mines, telecom infrastructure, retail chains, etc. So companies cannot instantly remove these sorts of things, and they can't let go of them without taking massive cost to their budget. So even if a revolution increases uncertainty, firms generally prefer to wait the uncertainty out. It is likely true, however, that uncertainty means no more foreign direct investment, but it doesn't result in foreign direct investment that was already there fleeing in most instances. The second thing that it ignores is just that in a revolutionary crisis, there is very rarely a buyer's market, which means that if firms wanted to sell their assets, they would have to do so at absurdly low costs. And so it is therefore frequently worth it for firms to hold out through periods of instability to hope that the costs of the assets that they currently hold are recuperated. And at the point that they begin to get recuperated, all of a sudden an optimism bias kicks in. You think that things are getting better, and so you're unlikely to sell them. So the result of that is just that, well, it is true that revolutions and instability decrease the foreign direct investment that are flowing into a place to some extent. Well, it is also counterbalanced by the fact that frequently strings attached to foreign direct investment want to take advantage of the instability to fund specific things that they want, that sort of stuff. The point is that foreign direct investment there already frequently doesn't disappear as a result of revolutions. Okay, it's also frequently worth thinking about how the portions of state power are distributed. So what factions exist inside of these pillars of power? What are their independent incentives? How do those interact with the revolution? To what extent are revolutionaries reliant or vulnerable to them, etc.? So, for example, it is generally best for revolutionary vanguards if the military is either split with no one group able to emerge dominant as a dominant faction, or the military is nearly wholly behind the unified revolutionary faction. But it is frequently worth thinking about what the military wants, what incentives they might have, what ways they might be able to grasp power, what ways they might be able to co-opt revolutionary factions, that sort of thing, how the military interplays with the revolution itself, what factions there are inside of the military, what different wings inside of the military might want to try and take advantage of the situation to gain excess military power. As a result of this, frequently militaries are quite instrumental players inside of revolutions. So just think about the incentives that come along with that and the new capacities that you have as a military maybe in these situations of instability. Second, think about the role of elites. We've kind of already touched on this, but many elites will be attached to the old regime and will have very strong incentives to foment unrest. And so think about how they're likely to play into this, what things might supercharge the fomented unrest, what things might bolster the old regime's claims to power inside of the new revolutionary landscape. At the same time, pushing these elites that are attached to the old regime into existential conflicts with the state probably means that those with the most capital and connections now are put on death ground and are granted a sort of existential incentive to fight the new guard. So very frequently you don't want to just get rid of all of the old elites. You need to figure out some way to balance their power with the revolution's wants. And I think it is quite difficult to actually balance that in the wake of a revolution, because very, very frequently, revolutionaries will be so radicalized by the revolution, by their success, they just want to take out all of their existing anger on the old regime. Additionally, many elites will, as previously mentioned, not feel ideologically attached to the revolution and just prefer a stable regime. So given those incentives, what might that faction of elites, which probably have a lot of power, do to create the stability that is best for them, their assets, and that sort of thing. Also, many elites will want to co-opt the revolution for their own gains, so try to think about what avenues elites might have to co-opt the power vacuums that are created by revolutions. It's also worth thinking about the role of foreign actors. So this is very similar to the stuff we've already talked about, but maybe it advantages particular states to see mass social unrest, and so they're quite willing to fund not only the revolution in the first instance, but maybe disparate wings within the revolution to create and foment social unrest afterwards. Or maybe they all of a sudden turn their funding to the old guard to try and make them create some more unrest inside of the post-revolutionary space. Maybe some states don't want to change from the old regime, and so will also work to foment unrest, or will work to bolster the old regime's power in maybe ungoverned parts of the state that are generated as a result of this. Maybe some states support the revolution ideologically, or because of pledges made during the revolution's process, or maybe just because they think they can take advantage of revolutionary rulers, and therefore have strong incentives to, say, funnel as much money as possible. So very frequently, the United States and China both will funnel large funds of money into a revolutionary group post-revolution in the hopes that, and this is probably not actually true, but it's an incentive that you can weaponize in debate, in the hopes that the post-revolution state is more willing to side with one over the other, and you can kind of argue that there is a good race to the top that occurs as a result of this. The seventh thing to consider is just the role of the old guard itself. So frequently, the people who were in bureaucratic positions previously have the most institutional knowledge. Maybe there's a lack of institutional knowledge outside of that, and so you need to harness some of the old guard, maybe the less attached members, the less ideological members, to actually have a successful state apparatus post-revolution. It's also just very rare that you fully get rid of the old guard in any given revolution. So think about how the existing portions of it, maybe the existing portions of populations that support them but don't have a ton of power, but maybe still have, after a revolution institutes a democracy, the democratic capability to elect members that were associated with the previous regime into some spaces of power. Think about how those interface with the revolution itself, how those might delegitimize revolutionary wants at the point that you turn it into a fully democratic system or whatever. And also sometimes, while frequently very difficult to justify internally, it may be best to provide the old regime with access to political institutions so that the existing portions of it don't have to resort to means outside of politics to express their wants, so they don't have to turn to violence, so they don't have to do their own sort of revolutions, so they don't try and generate their own ungoverned spaces. Okay, that's all on revolutions for now. Again, we'll come back to this, and sorry for the lack of specific case studies. Specifically, what I would recommend reading up about if you want to learn more about revolutions. One, there's this really cool book that I just ran into that I didn't have time to dig into thoroughly before this presentation on how revolutions work and sort of a theory of revolutions, and so I've attached that in the supplemental material. But additionally, it's worth looking into the wave of youth revolutions that occurred fairly recently. So this started sort of in the, I think, 2024 July revolutions in Bangladesh, but it also includes the revolution in Nepal, the revolution in Madagascar, and then there were a bunch of youth protests that didn't result in revolutions in some other places, and then there were a couple that started to move in that direction but then got cracked down on. And so it is worth looking into all of those. Very frequently, debates come up about whether or not the youth involved in those protests should transition into formal political roles. And so preparing to debate that is quite useful. I think that debate at its best is not about whether or not it is good to have younger people involved in politics, but more what that means for the revolution itself, what the sort of existing tensions within maybe oppositional parties that would otherwise take place are, how those are representative of the wants of the revolution, whether or not it is good to have like people who directly represented the revolution in political roles, etc. Although it is generally worth also doing the sort of basic material, which is to say, well, they're young, they have less capital accumulation, they have less connections, they're probably not as experienced in interfacing with various international actors, etc. So it is worth thinking about that, even if that isn't necessarily the crux of the debate at its best form. Anyway, that's all for today. Hopefully this was enjoyable. Anyway, that's all for today. Tomorrow we'll be covering Well, it depends on where I position this, but I believe feminism.